Okay, this is a walkthrough of the second year AQA philosophy exam, the Metaphysics of God side of this. So we're going to look at a standard exam paper and just run through how to answer some of the usual questions that will get asked here. So these are the questions that I've selected to look at. There's a range from across the whole of the Metaphysics of God paper. So starting from the religious language stuff on the 3 and 5 mark through the ontological argument 5 mark, a problem of evil 12 mark question, and the essay on the cosmological argument. We're not going to cover absolutely everything that you could say for all of these questions, but we'll look at some answers which should allow you to reach the top band marks for some of these questions here. So just a quick reminder of the do's and don'ts for some of these short questions. So I'm calling the 3, 5 and 12 mark questions the short questions here. Standard things to do to remember to get nice and clear and precise detailed answers on these. Technical vocabulary helps with these. Sometimes examples will be appropriate, not so much with the 3 mark questions, but perhaps with the 5 and the 12 mark questions. And if it's about a standard argument, if it's about a particular version, say, of the problem of evil, or a particular version of the cosmological or ontological arguments, then premises and conclusions numbered are preferable. So that helps you get all of the clear steps in the argument across and to show the logical links between those and the conclusions. Try not to waffle or go into redundant material, which is irrelevant. You don't need introductions or conclusions for any of these 3, 5 or 12 mark questions, and try and stick to a sort of good time for the questions overall here. So you won't need more than kind of 5 minutes, 2 or 3 sentences for a 3 mark question, maybe 10 minutes for a 5 mark, up to about 20 for a 12 mark question. And really importantly, don't include more than you're asked to include. Stick to what the question asks. Don't evaluate, go into your opinion, or give extra replies or criticisms unless you're explicitly asked to. Okay, so let's start with the definition questions. Usually a 3 mark question will be to define something. In this case, I've gone for the religious language topic and Hare's notion of a blik. So what does he mean by a blik, and how would we answer this? I think 2 or 3 sentences usually suffices for these questions. So Hare defines a blik as a non-cognitive attitude towards reality that are not verified or falsified by empirical evidence, but are nevertheless meaningful. So Hare here is a non-cognitivist in the religious language topic. We'll see a little bit more about what that means in a second, but this is the key idea of a blik. Hare says these are meaningful as they give us a fundamental perspective on the world and affect what we believe and do. You wouldn't have to get into the explanation of his example here, but he gives this example of the paranoid student who is convinced that the university professors are out to murder him, and however many professors are presented to him and however polite they are, he takes this as further evidence that they are out to murder him and that are cunningly disguising this. So what more broadly is this distinction between cognitivism and non-cognitivism in religious language? Well, you've got A.J. Ayer here, Freddie Ayer, and Richard Hare, who we've just mentioned below. They're both crucial in this debate here. You wouldn't have to get necessarily into their whole arguments. You would have to just illustrate the difference between the two sides of this debate here. So the question here is explain the difference between cognitivism and non-cognitivism in relation to religious language. So let's have a look at what we could say. Well, it's a question asking about whether religious claims aim at truth in much the same way as non-religious claims or beliefs about the world. If I describe how many chairs are in the room, I'm aiming to give a true description of how many chairs are in the room. So is religious language doing the same kind of thing? Well, a cognitivist account of religious language says It is. It argues that religious claims aim to describe how the world or reality really is. The technical word you could use for this is that these claims are truth apt. They can be proven to be true or false. Another way of talking about that is to say that they are propositional. For example, the sentence "God exists" expresses the belief that God exists, which is true or false depending on whether it describes or misdescribes reality, in the same way as you could describe or misdescribe the number of chairs in the room. If you're a cognitivist about the claim that God exists, you can describe or misdescribe reality using that statement. On the other hand, non-cognitivists believe that religious language claims aren't truth apt in the same way. They don't aim to describe the world through assertions or propositions which may be true or false. They're not the same kind of thing as statements like "there's 22 chairs in the room." Instead, they express non-belief-like attitudes towards the world, things like emotions, desires, faith, or guiding principles. This is pretty much what Hare was getting at with the idea of a blik, which we looked at previously. A perspective on the world which isn't open to proof or disproof. Sometimes I've talked in class about the idea of a belief in fate as a kind of blik, or perhaps a non-cognitive attitude here. It might help you understand or make sense of certain events, but it's not something which is outright verifiable or falsifiable. So in this context, the sentence "God exists" expresses a commitment to a certain way of life or interpreting the world. Okay, so on to the ontological arguments then. There's a variety of ontological arguments. Some questions here just to have a think about. I've picked one of the trickier ones to look at here. Norman Malcolm, the 20th century philosopher, defends a version of this argument, and he's essentially defending Anselm's second ontological argument. You might, for revision, think about what the difference was between Anselm's second version and his first version of the ontological argument before looking at the answer to this. You might also think about what the difference is between contingent and necessary existence. So it's similar to the idea of contingent and necessary truths, but do focus on existence if you're talking about the ontological argument. And then, if you're happy with these distinctions, you might think about the four possibilities concerning God's existence that Malcolm puts forward. He's trying to logically break down an exhaustive list of the only ways in which God could exist, and then to try and show that he must exist using this way of thinking about it. So let's start with this distinction between contingent and necessary existence. Something exists contingently if it could also not exist. So contingent things depend on other things to exist. For example, islands, in the example we looked at with Anselm. Necessary beings, however, must exist. They could not exist. They don't depend on anything else to exist, and they can't come into or go out of existence. In this sense, something necessary just has to exist. It's something that would be inconceivable to imagine not existing, I think, on this line of argument. So how does Malcolm make use of this distinction? Well, God is conceived then, on Malcolm's view, following Anselm, as the greatest possible being, one which is, in Malcolm's words, absolutely unlimited. There are four possibilities regarding his existence. The first and second involve God existing contingently or not existing contingently. It is the case for the first possibility that God exists, but he might not have existed. And on the second possibility, he doesn't exist, but he might exist. The third possibility is that God does not exist necessarily, which would mean it is logically contradictory. It is impossible for God to exist. What Malcolm has in mind here with logically impossible existence are things like four-sided triangles or married bachelors. These things cannot exist because they are logically contradictory. The last possibility is that God exists necessarily. Now, if we follow our definition of God, and we understand that God is the greatest possible being, if he is absolutely unlimited, then he cannot be contingent. According to Malcolm, this rules out our first two possibilities. They're simply not compatible with a being which is perfect, the greatest possible being, an absolutely unlimited being. Such a being could not be contingent. So the existence of an absolutely unlimited being is either logically necessary or logically impossible because of some internal contradiction in its properties, as we discussed with four-sided triangles or married bachelors. But Malcolm wants to say there's no such contradiction in the idea of God. It's not an incoherent idea in the way that a four-sided triangle is incoherent. So Malcolm arrives then at the conclusion that God's existence, if we follow his initial premises, is not impossible, and so God's existence must be necessary. If we accept that God is genuinely the greatest possible being, an absolutely unlimited being, he cannot exist contingently. This rules out our first two possibilities. And it's not contradictory to say that God exists, which rules out our third possibility. As these are the only possibilities regarding God's existence, it must follow, says Malcolm, in what we have here is an a priori and deductive argument, one which proceeds without experience, purely from an understanding of the concept of God alone. And if the premises are true, the conclusion must follow. It must be the case that God exists. So on to a 12-mark question. What we have here is a question in two parts. This is a familiar way of asking 12-mark questions, which will often be to outline an argument and a criticism, or in this case, outline the evidential problem of evil and a response, namely Hick's soul-making defense. So let's have a look at what we would do to answer this. So firstly, we would outline the evidential problem. There are two versions of the problem of evil that we need to know, the logical version and the evidential version of the problem. And the evidential version of the problem is crucially different, and it accepts the logical possibility of God's existence. It might be, grants the evidential problem, that God has a good reason to allow the kind of evil in the world that exists. But it points out that the distribution and spread of evil in the world is disproportionate, and it's something which falls largely on the back of those who already suffer. So we start with this premise here that there are cases of disproportionately great suffering that an omnipotent and all-loving God could have chosen to prevent without losing some greater good. So we've granted the possibility that God might exist, but on looking at the spread of evil in the world, it seems unlikely that a good and omnipotent God would exist. So this seems unlikely because if God is genuinely all-powerful and all-knowing and all-loving, he would want to get rid of this kind of suffering. He would have the power to do so, and he would know about the suffering where it exists. As he hasn't done this, as this suffering continues, then it's unlikely on this view that God exists. So Hume made a kind of version of this problem. William Rowe is famous for defending a version of this problem here. So it's important to spell out that this evidential argument purports to show that evil counts against theism in the sense that the existence of evil lowers the probability that God exists, rather than demonstrating that God's existence is logically impossible if God exists. It's not trying to show that God definitely doesn't exist. It's trying to show that it's unlikely that God exists, given the nature and distribution of suffering in the world. So this is an inductive argument. It works on the basis that if the premises are true, the conclusion might still be false. We've granted that God possibly has a good reason for this kind of evil, but it's unlikely. And it proceeds from evidence, from empirical premises. So it's an a posteriori argument, which works on the basis of experience. So that's the evidential problem of evil. So how does John Hick respond? The soul-making defense proceeds through a number of steps. Firstly, it's important to say that Hick is arguing that a good God is compatible with evil, as the world is a veil of soul-making where we must learn to become better by dealing with evil. He is saying that there's no contradiction, in other words, between a good God and the existence of evil. So what does he mean by a veil of soul-making? Well, through freely choosing to act selflessly, according to Hick, we get closer to God and gradually overcome what he calls the epistemic distance, the gap between our initial ignorance and our love of God, between his perfection and our ignorance. So demonstrating, he thinks, that there's no contradiction between an all-powerful and all-loving God and the existence of evil. Evil is there to challenge us so we can move forward and develop all sides of the human personality and become well-rounded and moral human beings. We need some challenge. We need obstacles in order to develop ourselves in this way. And this is precisely what Hick means by soul making. It's kind of character building. You have to go through the difficult stuff in order to be a better person and to ultimately, in Hick's view, kind of engage with moral virtue and love, and eventually this will be rewarded in the afterlife. So this takes a different view from the free will defense. Original sin, on this view, is not a corruption that stains us forever from our freedom. It's an understandable lapse due to our spiritual immaturity and weakness at an early stage in our humanity. So instead of regarding man as a created in a kind of finished state of perfection, who then goes through original sin and then the fall to disastrously corrupt our nature, this tradition, building on Saint Irenaeus, the Iranian tradition, sees man as still in the process of creation. So this is what's called an eschatological approach, so about last things or the end of life, where we develop our soul, according to Hick, fully in the afterlife. Okay, on to the final question, the essay question, the big question, the more challenging one, I think, here. So there's a different set of skills you're being assessed on for these questions, remember, and this is the only place that you'll be giving your view and weighing up and evaluating what you think of the arguments that are put forward. Now, I've picked the cosmological argument, which is a very big argument, and we're only going to select a few of the kind of key points here and try and focus a bit on the evaluation rather than just listing a bunch of versions of the argument. So do be very careful if you're writing essays on this not to simply list a bunch of versions of the cosmological argument. The marks here, remember, are for you saying whether it's any good. So we want to focus mainly on objections and replies, criticisms and responses to this. And we'll be focusing a little bit on the Kalam argument and then on Aquinas here. And I'm not going to touch on Descartes or Leibniz's version, although if you could write loads, then perhaps you could talk about those too. So what is the cosmological argument saying? Well, very basically, the idea of the cosmological argument is something like this. Everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence. This is true for everything. This is a metaphysical principle across the board. The universe must have a cause, and that cause is God. So someone outside of the universe who is uncaused is the first cause, and this is the kind of basic idea of the cosmological argument. So there are obviously more sophisticated versions we'll be looking at, but if you're still a bit puzzled about what's going on with the cosmological argument, maybe come back to this and just kind of think about this as the core of the argument. So an example that I'm just going to walk us through here of how you might set out an essay to this. So we would want an introduction. We'll talk about what goes into that in a second. We could talk about the Kalam version of the argument and some key criticisms of this. So we'll look at quantum physics as a criticism, the criticism that infinite series are possible, and Hume's criticism that the causal principle is not necessarily true. Then we'll look at Aquinas and his first and second way, some key criticisms of this, whether God is needed now, and how he might respond to that with the notion of atemporal causation, the idea of what caused God, the standard kind of objection here, and using his reply here of the third way. At least that's how I'm going to frame a response to this objection. And then we can work in Hume and the idea that there's no such thing as a necessary being here as well. So the fallacy of composition is the final big criticism on the syllabus that we'll look at. And then I'll give you some possible ways of concluding an argument on this. Okay, so what goes into an introduction? Starting off an essay, you want to be clear on a few things. What kind of argument is it? What is the argument saying? And what do you think? So we've just talked very basically about the cosmological argument as an argument from the first cause. You might set out something like the basic version that I've just mentioned. You could explain then that it's an a posteriori argument. It's something which works from experience, so our experience of the world's existence. And there's a little bit of perhaps difference in how people interpret these arguments. I'm going to be reading the arguments that we look at here as a posteriori yet deductive. This is the way that I think Aquinas intended the argument to be read, and we'll have a look at the potential problems with that. So let's start with the Kalam argument from the Arabic tradition. One thing to be clear on, Kalam was not a person. It's the Arabic word for speech. It was originally devised by a number of philosophers. Al-Ghazali, I think, is the person that the textbooks focus on mostly here. And this is quite a complex argument. So I've tried to add in a few of the kind of explanations of important premises here, which you could potentially, I think, skip over a little bit in an essay, because we want, as I was saying before, to get clear on what the criticisms of the arguments are. But this is the argument in a relatively full and detailed form. First of all, it starts with the causal principle, the idea that things that begin to exist have a cause of their existence. Notice it does not say that everything has a cause. This would be to fatally undermine the argument, and this is a classic straw man attack on the cosmological argument. No version of the cosmological argument says that everything has a cause. So The Kalam argument wants to propose that actual infinities cannot exist. Why is this? This is Al-Ghazali's point. So you can go with different examples here, but I've said that because to apply the concept of infinity to actually existing things is absurd. For example, if we have a library with an infinite number of red books, and then we were to add an infinite number of black books, we would still have the same number of books, which is contradictory and therefore impossible. What Al-Ghazali is trying to do here is to demonstrate that to apply the notion of infinity to actually existing things, such as events in the universe's history, is impossible, so the universe must therefore have a beginning. So the universe cannot be infinite, it follows, so it must have a beginning. If the universe has a beginning, then it has a cause. Now, a further important premise in this argument is that if something is caused, this is for two possible reasons. It is either because it occurs naturally, or it is willed into existence by a personal being. So the grass grows naturally, and we create things like chairs and computers to serve our purposes. Those are examples of a natural cause, the grass growing, and a personal cause, something willed into existence like the computer or device you're watching this on. Now, natural laws did not exist before the universe, so the universe cannot have been caused naturally. So what's the only other possible cause we have? It's a personal cause. It must have been willed into existence. But what sort of thing could possibly will a universe into existence? Well, something which exists outside of the universe, something which is infinitely powerful, and something which is infinitely wise. So the Kalam argument proposes, therefore, there must be a God that willed the universe into existence. So what's wrong with this argument? Philosophers have tried to attack this on a number of grounds. Quantum physics is one of them. You don't have to be an expert on quantum physics to, I think, make sense of this objection. But the objection goes something like this, that in quantum physics, we have demonstrated the possibility of things coming into existence without a direct or identifiable cause. At the subatomic levels, the law of cause and effect appear to break down and things spontaneously come into being. There's a lot to be said about quantum physics here, but I'm going to keep this relatively basic. And this is the kind of objection that is used against the Kalam argument and the causal principle. But defenders of this argument say this doesn't work. So William Lane Craig, one of the most famous contemporary philosophers of religion and defenders of Christianity, and of, in particular, the Kalam argument, says that in reply, this is not totally uncaused. The behavior of these particles depend on some prior conditions existing. The atoms and molecules that they're part of exist before them, and the quantum particles kind of behave in certain ways within those conditions. So it doesn't defeat the argument because there are no prior conditions at the start of the universe. Craig wants to say that there's something which is important here, which is the difference between something being unpredictable, which is what the quantum particles are, and absolutely uncaused. Now, there's no evidence, says Craig, to say that the quantum particles are absolutely uncaused. The fact that they are unpredictable is a quite different point and doesn't defeat the Kalam argument. So what about the possibility of an infinite series? This is a big criticism, and I'm only going to go really with one version of this here. But science, again, appealing to cosmology and physics, has not ruled out something existing before the Big Bang. This is an area that you can look up, but there are physicists who want to say that the universe potentially is infinite. The Big Bang wasn't the first kind of event or thing that ever happened, and that the universe potentially extends backwards before that. So Sean Carroll is a very good and philosophically well-informed physicist. I recommend looking up his videos or his books on this, in particular The Big Picture. So some argue then the universe has existed many times over, coming into and disappearing out of existence perhaps infinitely. So therefore the universe could be infinite. This isn't absolutely impossible. In the textbooks, you'll find discussions of mathematical and logical possibility of an infinite series. The philosopher Mackey, who we touched on with the problem of evil, talks about the logical possibility of an infinite series extending backwards without a first member. He says there's nothing logically contradictory about this, and argues that this is a perfectly plausible idea. Finally, on the Kalam argument, we'll mention Hume and his fork. The idea of the causal principle, Hume says, is not something which is necessary, and this follows from our previous point. To say that everything that has a beginning has a cause, in Hume's way of talking about these things, is a matter of fact. It's a truth of experience, a truth about the world. It makes sense, according to Hume, to say that some things do not have a cause. In fact, we've just looked at examples which seem to be intuitively plausible, things that can be uncaused, perhaps, or extend infinitely. So for Hume, this means that this is a truth which would need checking with experience and isn't kind of necessarily true. It's not a universal claim which has to be true. It's something which perhaps makes sense in some cases, but is not impossible to imagine exceptions to. Therefore, it is at least possible for Hume that the universe could be uncaused. We can't simply assume the truth of this principle. However, defenders of the Kalam argument, of metaphysics more broadly, often say that Hume's fork is self-refuting. It undermines itself. And it's an example of precisely the sort of metaphysical speculation that it intends to rule out. So remember, Hume is saying there's only two kinds of knowledge. Knowledge from experience, the matters of fact, which can be imagined otherwise, and you have to check using your empirical data, and analytic truths, which are true simply because of the meanings of the words. So bachelors are unmarried, triangles have three sides. We don't need to go around checking those with experience because we can know them from their definition. These are the only two ways you can know things for Hume. The problem is, Hume's fork itself is a claim to knowledge. It claims that all truths are either empirical or analytic, yet itself isn't the kind of thing that we can empirically verify, and doesn't on the face of it appear to be an analytic truth. So Hume's fork is potentially then self-refuting, it's self-disproving, and maybe we should discard Hume's criticisms as a result of this. Okay, on to Aquinas then. Aquinas has a number of arguments. First three of his ways to God are versions of the cosmological argument that we need to know. The first way then is the way from motion or change. When Aquinas talks about motion, he is talking in a very broad sense about change in the sense of an actualization of a potential, as he puts it. So what does this mean? Let's say you're revising and you could potentially get this grade in philosophy. If you revise really hard, if you get your questions nice and precise and clear and your argument's really persuasive, then you might actualize that potential. You might get the grade that you want. You might then go on to actualize a potential career. So you are potentially a doctor, or potentially a librarian, or potentially whatever it is. You might actualize that potential if you go on to take the right steps and fulfill that potential. So Aquinas says if we look around us in the world, there are things in motion in this way. There's lots of things which are moving or changing, actualizing their potentials. There are acorns turning into oak trees. There's all sorts of change in the world. But nothing changes itself for Aquinas. Nothing moves by itself. So wood is the example I think he gives. Can't set itself on fire. It needs something from outside which is hot to set it on fire. But now let's imagine that this chain of movers and moved went backwards forever. If we imagine everything was moved by something else, there would be an infinite regress of movers. Now for Aquinas, this doesn't make sense. There can't be an infinite regress because there would be nothing to start the chain and therefore no motion right now. So the conclusion Aquinas draws from this is there must be an unmoved mover, unmoved prime mover, using the language of Aristotle, something purely actual without unrealized potential. And he says this is what God is, something outside of the chain of motion which sets that chain in motion. So an ultimate kind of uncaused cause, going back to our original basic definition of the argument. It's worth just mentioning the problem with this idea of an infinite regress, because this throws students sometimes. So an infinite regress is a series which extends backwards with no first member. So let's say this textbook had infinite editions, each copied from the previous one. What's the problem with imagining that this textbook has infinite editions and each of them is copied from the previous one and they just go back forever without a first member? Well, I think this just wouldn't be possible. This would be unimaginable because we could never fully explain its contents and where it came from. There has to be a first cause to start the series. There has to be someone to write the textbook, to make that first copy from which we can then copy everything else. So this is an example that Leibniz gives to demonstrate something in his argument here, but I think it works equally for Aquinas. So Aquinas goes on to give a second argument. And the second argument is very similar to the first, but this is known as the way from causation. So sometimes people ask, well, what's the difference then about the first way and the second way? I think one way of understanding it is the first way focuses on why change happens, and the second way focuses on why there is anything at all. So what's the second way saying? Well, similarly to the first way, it talks not about motion, but about causes and effects. So for Aquinas, nothing in the world can be the efficient or full cause of itself. For this standard reason, if it were, it would have to exist before itself, which is impossible. And if the chain of causes were infinite, and there were no first cause, there would be no effects. In other words, no world. Therefore, given that there are causes around us, there cannot be an infinite regress of causes, and therefore there must be a first cause which is not itself caused. Again, a prime or uncaused cause which is God. So how are Aquinas' arguments here, especially the second way, different from the Kalam argument? I think these differences are subtle but important. The Kalam argument insisted that there was a first point in the universe and that an infinite regress of events in the universe was impossible. Aquinas doesn't make that claim. Aquinas' point is more about the nature of the cause here. So Aquinas focuses on what the syllabus refers to as atemporal causation, whereas the Kalam argument is a argument from temporal causation, which is focusing on time. The Kalam argument then says there is a first point in time, whereas Aquinas does not insist on that. So Aquinas is concerned to show that there must be an uncaused cause, even if the universe has always existed. So he grants this as a possibility and says that the important thing really is the notion of a series of cause and effect cannot exist without a fundamental sustaining cause. So when he argues that there must be a first cause, he doesn't mean first in the order of events extending backwards into the past. That's not the claim that he's making, whereas it is the claim that the Kalam argument is making. What Aquinas means is that there must be a most fundamental cause of things which keeps them in existence at every moment. So his notion of an uncaused cause is to do with the way he sees things having either kind of fundamental or instrumental power. He thinks that, the fire is an instrument that can be used to set the wood on fire, but God is different to that. God is not an instrumental cause. God is a sort of first or fundamental or sustaining cause. He is the thing that keeps everything in existence, including these series and chains of cause and effect and motion and change. So one way of thinking about this notion of a sustaining cause is to compare it perhaps to a guitarist making music. A sustaining cause is where if the guitarist takes their hand off the strings, then there is no music. This is a little bit like Aquinas' notion of God as a sustaining cause. For Aquinas, if God did not exist to sustain the causes in the world, then nothing would exist. Everything ultimately depends on God to exist. So in this sense, he is a fundamental and sustaining cause. So what's wrong with Aquinas' arguments here? There are a few things we can say. One of the famous criticisms comes from Bertrand Russell, who accuses Aquinas of committing what he calls the fallacy of composition. And a fallacy of composition arises where someone infers that something which is true of the whole follows from the fact that it is true of some part of the whole. So in this context, the fallacy here is in moving from the idea that things in the world have causes to the conclusion that the universe as a whole has a cause. Now, Russell's example to show why this is wrong is that we cannot jump from the conclusion that each individual human has a mother to the fact that the whole world has one mother. Not everyone in the world has the same mother, obviously. That would be a fallacy. So in making the jump from individual things having causes to the whole universe having a cause, a similar mistake is being made, according to Russell. But I think defenders of this argument could respond that this has not been demonstrated to absolutely be a fallacy. It depends on which features you focus on. For example, it's not a fallacy to say that the bricks in the wall are red so that the wall is red, although it might be a fallacy to say that the bricks in the wall are small so the wall is small. It depends which of the features of the elements you're focusing on. So it might be that there is an essential similarity between the parts of the universe being caused and the whole universe being caused. There's an argument to be had here, and the fallacy hasn't been fully demonstrated. It's possible, but you would have to have further arguments to demonstrate whether it is or isn't. second criticism is sometimes raised here of whether God is needed right now. It might be that if we accept arguments for the first cause, that God did create the world, but perhaps once he's caused the universe, he ceased existing and it's carried on ticking over on its own kind of mechanisms. I think we've kind of dealt with this in the way that we've set out Aquinas' arguments already. This clearly is misreading Aquinas, although it might be said to apply to the Kalam argument, because Aquinas focused quite clearly on God as the first cause in the sense of a fundamental sustainer of things in every present moment. So if we go back to the guitarist and the music example, if the guitarist takes his hand off the strings, there is no music, in the same way as if there were no God, there would be no series of cause and effect, because that has to ultimately terminate in God. So third criticism here, what caused God? Another standard criticism of Aquinas and the cosmological argument. Often people will say, well, everything has a cause, you say, so what caused God? As if that's just a sort of shut down criticism of the whole argument. So why is this first cause God unique in that he does not require a cause? Criticism is saying that advocates of the cosmological argument are just saying this as it suits their theory. You could put a fallacy here and say, well, they're committing the fallacy of special pleading. You're saying, well, okay, this thing applies to all of the other things in the universe, but not to the being that I'm defending, the God that I'm saying lies outside of this sequence. So how can Aquinas respond to this kind of special pleading objection? What is it about God that means that he stands outside of this chain and sequence of cause and effect and so on that we've talked about so far? Well, I think he can appeal to his contingency argument, his third way to show that God must exist if we follow the reasoning that he sets out. So Aquinas talks about contingent things existing in the universe. The fact that tables and chairs and trees and rivers come into and go out of existence means that they exist contingently. They don't have to exist. They depend on other things to exist. Now he points out if everything were contingent, there would be a time when nothing existed. And I think he's getting at the idea here that things which are contingent come into and go out of existence. So across a potentially infinite space of time, there would be a time where nothing existed. But if this was so, there would be nothing now, because nothing comes from nothing. Things don't just spring into existence out of nowhere. If contingent things depend on other things, that sequence cannot extend indefinitely. So contingent things do exist, we know that much. There must be then something for that sequence of contingency to ultimately depend on. There must be something that exists necessarily outside of that sequence of contingent things. So as with his other arguments, therefore there must be something that exists necessarily, and this is God. God is the necessary being which causes and sustains and acts as the fundamental metaphysical grounding of all contingent things. So we might say to the criticism, what caused God, that this is not a good criticism because it misunderstands the logic of Aquinas' argument. Aquinas' point is that God is precisely the kind of thing that has to exist given our understanding of contingency, causes, and motion. If we accept that these things cannot have an infinite sequence, then there must be something outside of those sequences, and the best candidate we have for such a thing is something which is eternal, omnipotent, omniscient, and all good. So a final objection, and then we'll think about what we could say in evaluation overall here. Hume And the empiricists say there's no such thing as a necessarily existing being. So Hume, as we've seen, states that any claim about what exists can be imagined otherwise. Any matter of fact can be imagined to be different. If I claim that this water bottle exists, it might not have existed. If I claim that there are 20 people in the business class next door, they might not exist. There might be a different number. There might be no one at all in the business class. We would have to check these things using empirical evidence. Now, it's not logically contradictory for Hume to say God doesn't exist, so we need experience to prove that he does. It's not, necessarily true to say that God exists. It's a claim about something in the world that needs evidence to back it up. So for Hume's fork, nothing can exist necessarily. The only things that can be necessary are statements, analytic truths, which create contradictions if you deny them. And those are things which are created by us by definitions and convention. So bachelors are unmarried, triangles have 3 sides. These are the sorts of things that you can say are necessary truths, but only because of the meanings we attach to the words. They don't have any necessary bearing on what exists in the world. So where does this leave us, and what could we say in evaluation here? Well, a few things to think about. Against the argument, we could question how much the argument actually proves maybe there is a cause, but does it have to be the God of classical theism? Has Aquinas and the other defenders of the argument here proved that it is the God which is omnipotent, omniscient, and all good? Or could there be a sort of first cause in a more fundamental or basic way? If we think of Aristotle as the kind of founder of an argument like this, that was a long time before Christianity. And Aristotle didn't believe in the Christian God that Aquinas did, but he still used the same reasoning. So how much does this argument actually prove for the God of classical theism? We might use this idea of special pleading. So how convincing is this idea that by making God an exception to the principle that things have causes, couldn't the universe just be the exception? Couldn't we say that the universe exists and that is all? Hume likewise says the opposite of the principle can be imagined coherently, so experience would be needed to establish it for sure. Perhaps we should withhold judgment on the causal principle and not assume its truth, therefore the conclusion overall doesn't follow. Alternatively, you might favour the argument. Perhaps the causal principle appears to be overwhelmingly supported by empirical evidence. Pretty much everything that we know of existing has a cause, so the universe should too. And the best candidate for something that's caused the universe is something incredibly powerful, incredibly wise, and incredibly good. Perhaps this gives us a defence of the argument. Whatever you argue, it should be clear from the start and backed up throughout the essay. Don't just pick a conclusion at the end and pop it on like the punchline to a joke. The whole argument here has to be sustained from the start. So think about what you believe to be the best objection here and what you believe to be the best response, and try and prioritize those when you write about this. Be nice and clear in what you're going to argue from the start. To wrap up, have a think about the tricky points. Why does the cosmological argument not say that everything has a cause? Why can't there be actual infinities according to the Kalam argument? And what's the difference between the Kalam argument and Aquinas' arguments, particularly the second way?